Hi, this is Mike Gant, and this is the Scriptural Christianity podcast. And on my podcast, I've been reading through the New Testament. We completed the New Testament a few weeks ago, and I've been preparing to start reading through the Old Testament, and we'll start that on November 1st, which is just a little over a week from, I guess it's a week from tomorrow. So mechanically speaking, I have to do a new podcast, do something different for iTunes, so it's complicated, and I don't need to take up your time with that. But I just wanted you to understand there are some mechanics involved in doing this that are not normally involved in the normal weekly or daily podcast, and that's why it takes this extra time. But I hope to have everything ready, and I'll try to send out a blog post in the next week, maybe giving a few more details. But I'll still continue trying to do this simultaneous audio podcast and video once a week, this weekly teaching. And today I will probably title this my testimony, and it'll become apparent why I do that as we go through here. But my focus is to tell you what the Bible is about. Like if this was the first time I ever talked to you and you didn't know me and all you knew was, hey, this guy has read the Bible a lot and he believes he has at least a general understanding of what it's about, I'm going to ask him what it's about. So if you ask me what the Bible is about, this is the answer I would give. It's about Jesus. That's as simply as I know how to put it. The Bible is about Jesus. The New Testament is more obviously about Jesus. But the Old Testament is equally about him, though not as obviously. And one of the reasons that we're going to read through the Old Testament together is that I want to demonstrate that. We'll read a chapter a day. There's 929 chapters in the Old Testament, which means that it will take, like 2.5 years to read through it, a chapter a day. It took a little over 6 months for us to read through the New Testament. Matter of fact, it's been maybe closer to 8 months, I guess. 260 chapters in the New Testament. So together, the Old and New Testaments over 1,000 chapters. So when we read through the Old Testament, I'm going to title the podcast "Reading the Old Testament with Jesus in Mind," because that's really the only way it has any relevance, at least for me, because I'm a Gentile. As far as I know, I don't have any Jewish blood in me. Maybe I do, I just don't know. I don't know a lot about my ancestry. I'm not like Jesus. I can't trace it all the way back to Adam. And my family is more or less kind of American mutts. Family's been here a while and sort of lost track of how everybody got here. And so I can't read the Old Testament and say, I'm a Jew, that applies to me, I'm a descendant of Abraham. I can't do that. But when I read about Jesus in the New Testament, it tells me that by having a relationship with him, I by that very fact have a relationship with the people of God in the Old Testament. That through Jesus I become a child of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And I inherit what they inherited. I inherit what David inherited. So if I can't read the Old Testament with Jesus in mind, it really doesn't have that much significance for me. It's what it says about Jesus that matters. And of course, because the New Testament demonstrates, records, testifies that Jesus is the promised Messiah, the promised Son of God, the promises having been made in the Old Testament, then we know that Jesus considered the Old Testament the Word of God. So if that's what he considered it as, anyone who's a follower of him is going to consider that too. So the Bible is about Jesus, and it's about Jesus in two fundamental ways. Number one is it explains that he is God come to earth. that God took on human flesh and became Jesus of Nazareth in order to show us how it's done, to show us how to live life. And then, upon being raised from the dead, he ascended into heaven, and that at his second coming, he resumed the full role of God from heaven. So while he was on earth, he was behaving as a human being because he was one. He was one of us. But back in heaven, he resumes his role as God and behaves as God. So Jesus, when I say the Bible, all the Bible can be reduced to Jesus, and that has two fundamental expressions. One is that Jesus is God, that if we know Jesus, we know what God is like. The Jesus we read about the Bible, that depicts the character, the nature, the personality of God. God's a person. We were made in his image. So we're persons, so he's a person. And Jesus, by understanding Jesus, we understand the mind of God. By understanding Jesus, we understand what God is like. So that's one part of it. The other part of it is that Jesus is our example as to how we should live as a human being. He's our model. He's the example we should follow. We should walk in his steps. Now, outwardly, that doesn't mean we're all going to be miracle workers and die by crucifixion. But it's his inner motivations. It's his dealing with rejection, his dealing with suffering, his dealing with unfairness. It's the way he dealt with it that we are to follow. And that's the example for us. We don't need instruction on how to be nice to people who are nice to us. We don't need instruction on how to be friends with people who are friends with us. We don't need instructions on how to be nice for people who cause us no problems. We do need instruction on how to live in a world where we're not getting treated the way we should be, or not being treated the way we want to be. That's what we need instruction about. And that's why there's so much about Jesus and the suffering. In his suffering, if you look at the Gospels, the majority of the time spent is on the last week of his life, when he was being treated with contempt, with hatred, with rejection, with all sorts of just every form of persecution you can imagine. And he bore up under that. He did not retaliate. He did not return evil for evil. Evil kept coming his way, and he kept returning good in its place. And so that's our example. So the whole Bible is about Jesus, and it's about him in two fundamental ways. If you understand him, recognize that, okay, that's how God thinks, is how Jesus thinks. That's how God talks, is how Jesus talks. And then secondly, I'm supposed to act like that too. Armed with that knowledge, you can live life in a radically different way than you used to live it, if you really embrace those things. Now, I myself did not know that this was the message of the Bible when I was growing up, even though I was raised in an ostensibly Christian home. My family was Roman Catholic. Now, that's primarily because my mother came from a Roman Catholic family, a large family, and they had been going to the same parish from the time she was a child. In fact, I think she would have been born while they were going to that church. And so she gets married. Now, my dad had been some type of Protestant. I don't know, a Baptist or a Methodist. I'm not really sure which. They didn't talk a lot about that. But in order to marry my mother, at that time, he had to commit to raising the children Catholic. And he had to become a Catholic himself. And he became a Catholic. I was the oldest son. I was born about a year after they were married. And I grew up going to Catholic church and doing Catholic things. I don't remember much of it about before school started, but once school started, they sent me to parochial school for the first 6 years of my education. And when you go to parochial school, at least then, I don't know if it's still that way now, but then you went to Mass every morning. We wore uniforms to school, white shirt, navy blue pants. The girls wore white blouses, navy blue jumpers. And we went to Mass. That was the first thing you did every morning. So I was going to Mass 5 days a week. And then on Sunday as a family, we went to church. So I was going to Mass 6 out of 7 days, 6 out of every 7 days. And I had a missal, we had a Bible in the house. I remember sitting on the coffee table, and I remember reading it from time to time. In the beginning, it said something about if you read this Bible so many minutes a day, you'll get like 500 days off of purgatory. And I was sort of interested in that. I mean, they taught us that when you died, if you were really, really good, you'd go to heaven, but most good people would have to go to purgatory first. And the amount of time you spent in purgatory, and somehow you were cleansed of your sins. I don't remember how, but the worse you were, the longer you had to stay there. And then if you were really bad, you went to hell. And when I was going to this parochial school, most of my teachers were nuns. They weren't all nuns, but I remember my first and second grade teacher were nuns. My third grade teacher was a lay person. My fourth grade teacher was a nun. And then my fifth grade teacher, I think one of them was a lay teacher. But we had religious instruction. Religion was a class, a subject that you studied, just like you had time you spent on math and time you spent on science. We spent time on religion, and I took the religion seriously. I prayed with the rosary, the little thing with the beads, and when we went to Mass, it was in Latin. So you had your missal, they called it. That was the sort of guidebook for the Mass. You could sort of learn Latin that way. And the priest would say, Kyrie eleison, and you'd respond with that. And I think that means Lord have mercy in Latin. And I actually became an altar boy during that time. I don't remember exactly how old I was when I first became an altar boy, but you could sign up, and I was very interested in that. And I remember one time, well, they had holy cards for the priests or for the saints. So there'd be like a holy card for Saint Joseph or a holy card for Saint Jude or whoever it was. And I collected these things. And I was collecting baseball cards at home, but at school I would collect these. In church I would collect these cards, and you just put them in your missal, and the more of those holy cards you had, the better. So I had a rosary and the holy cards. I did First Communion. I still have the picture of when I had my First Communion. They gave me a white missal, kind of a commemorative missal, and you had confirmation that came after your First Communion. I think confirmation was around when you're around 14 years old, sort of timed around a bar mitzvah for a Jewish person. I did not know much about Jewish people at all. I don't ever remember my parents talking about Jewish people. There weren't a lot in our town. I never really heard much about Jewish people until I got to junior high school, and all of a sudden there'd be 3 or 4 kids in our class that weren't there because, okay, this was Jewish holidays. I didn't know much about it. So I didn't know much about that. And I didn't really know much about Protestants, except they were really different. They weren't us. They were really different. And so, we were in the one true church and went all the way back to St. Peter, and they were Protestants. They were protesting. They didn't even have a good name. Their name automatically, spoke against them because they were Protestants. I got to watch the clock here because I have to keep the time of this within a certain time frame in order for the upload on YouTube to work properly, and my phone and all that different kind of stuff. So I remember in the church we had the Stations of the Cross, like different places around the church. I think there are 15 of them, and it depicts the different things that happened to Jesus on his crucifixion, his scourging by Pilate, when he was beaten by Herod, when he's carrying his cross, when Simon of Cyrene carries it for him for a while, when he's taking the cross. And so you go to each one of these Stations of the Cross in the church, and you stand before it. And sometimes you do it with your rosary, and sometimes you just do it without the rosary. I remember going to confession. My parents would take me to confession a lot, like on Saturdays. I think because my mother was going too. My father would take us to church with my mother every week, but I think he was somewhat reluctant, and he did. I mean, I only learned that later. I didn't know that when I was going to elementary school. Back then, it was still pretty. When I got to my teenage years, I began to drift away from the church, and I noticed later that my father did at the same time. So he wasn't that wrapped into it, and he would often complain about the priest or the nuns and what they taught, but not so much from a Protestant point of view, but just from a point of view of he didn't think they were doing what was right. My mother and father were very decent people. They were good people. They were responsible citizens. They didn't give in to like alcohol and stuff like that. My father's father had been an alcoholic, and I think he was determined not to do the same thing. But my parents never really taught. I mean, they didn't talk about God. God was not someone we talked about in the course of life. We went to church, and that was sort of, you went there, and that's where you had that kind of experience. But even on the way to church, on the way home, we weren't talking about God. It was just when you were there. I remember one time the nuns taught us about a scapula, and that was sort of like a medal. Sometimes you'd wear medals, but like with a saint on it. Well, a scapula was a thing that had some kind of picture on it, and it was like a ribbon. It wasn't metal. It was, I think, some kind of laminated thing of a saint or something. And a ribbon, it goes like this, and there's one in the back. And I should probably look that up, but they told us with the scapula, if you died with the scapula on, you would go straight to heaven. You wouldn't have to go to purgatory. Now, I don't know exactly why that was, but the Catholic Church at that time had a lot of those kind of rules, read the Bible so many minutes a day, you stay out of purgatory, you wear the scapula, go straight to heaven, don't have to go to purgatory. Well, I thought that was a pretty good deal. And no risk of hell at all. So I actually remember getting some Scotch tape. I'd wear the thing all the time. I wouldn't take it off. I don't know what I did when I was taking a shower, but I remember when I'd go to bed, I got some Scotch tape and taped the ribbon thing here and here because I was afraid it would fall off in the middle of the night. And then if I died, then, no heaven. So this was what I was taught. These are the things I was taught as I was growing up. And as I said, I should also add, I even considered becoming a priest at that time. Because when you're an altar boy and you're getting First Communion, you're doing all that kind of stuff, that's the kind of thing that people talk about. And my mother's family was thoroughly Catholic. And I actually had a cousin who had become a priest, and he'd gone to Rome to study. And one of my mother's classmates in high school went on to become a bishop. In fact, he went on to become an archbishop. He wasn't an archbishop at the time, but... So you ask yourself, would I be willing to be a priest? Well, somehow I knew, and this was, like as I say, somewhere between the first and the sixth grade, I knew I didn't want to be a priest because, I wanted to, but the celibacy thing, I just, even at that age, even though I wasn't interested in girls per se, I don't recall, that being a big issue, but I just knew that celibacy was not, I couldn't see that. That just didn't seem right to me. I say I wasn't interested in girls. You have crushes and stuff like that, but on girls in school, and you think about things. But I wasn't like some type of Romeo or something. But I just knew I didn't. I thought, well, I just can't do that. When I got to junior high, my parents moved, and they simultaneously took me and my brothers out of parochial school and put us in public school. So from the 7th grade on, I was in public school. So I was now down to going to Mass one day a week, and I just pretty quickly, tried to get out of going to church when I could. My father sort of stopped going, so that some of the pressure was off there, and I just, by the time I was in high school, I just, I never went to church, and I probably considered myself an agnostic from high school up until about my late 20s. So I was probably an agnostic by the 10th or 11th grade. And I didn't feel a conviction strong enough to say there is no God. I didn't feel that way, but I thought, who can know? You got Protestants, most of my friends are Protestants, and then you got these Jewish people, and you got Catholics, and who can figure all this stuff out? And then when I was in my late 20s, then I began to hear about Jesus. When I became an adult and got married, we didn't go to church. We had a child a couple of years after we got married. We still didn't go to church. But I started watching Norman Vincent Peale on Sunday mornings on the TV. There was a 30-minute TV program. And I sort of liked him. But he was sort of like a self-help kind of guy, feel good, positive thinking, And so it was an encouragement in that sense. But I was not attracted to anything else and not exposed really to any other kind of religion. But I remember I started my own business, and I grew it to the point where I was ready to hire somebody. And so I asked this guy that I had not talked to since high school, and I asked him to have lunch because I was thinking of hiring him. So I'd not seen him in like 10 years. I'm now in my late 20s, probably 27, 28 years old. And I had not seen him since high school, but I had heard that he was in the same general industry I was in. So I thought, okay, I'll catch up with him and maybe I can hire him. So we have lunch. We sit down. I invite him to lunch. We sit down, and pretty soon, what's new, what's been happening, and he says, well, I recently accepted Jesus Christ as my personal Lord and Savior. And at this point, my heart sank because this in the early part of the meal, and I'm thinking of hiring this guy. And obviously, if this is the kind of person he is, I'm not hiring him. I had not been exposed to very many of these type people, but he just seemed to me like a religious nut because he was talking this, born again. He said something about being born again, and I didn't know a lot about that, but I knew my father. I mentioned my father was raised a Protestant, Baptist, Methodist, something. He would watch Billy Graham when he came on. Well, I'd go through the room when he's watching Billy Graham, and I think sometimes sit there and watch a little bit, but I just never could. It was like I couldn't hear anything that was being said. But he tells me, hey, this is what happened. And I try to be polite. I'm listening. I give him all my reasons for, maybe if it's good for you, that's fine. And, doing my open-minded kind of response. And so we went on and finished the lunch. I was just interested in getting out of there as soon as I could. Well, the next day I go to my office, and sure enough, right there in front of my office door, I had my own office. At that point, I didn't have anybody else working for me, so the door was locked when I wasn't there. So I was sitting outside with it was books from him. He left me 3 books, and I thought, oh, hey, here we go. He's going to witness to me. And one of the books I remember was about Ecclesiastes. One of the books was by Francis Schaeffer, a very intellectual guy. I tried to read that book. That stuff was just, all that was over my head. And then the other book was Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. So I felt like, all right, look, I don't believe this stuff. I think these people that sound like they know it all. I thought I'll look at it, and then I'll give him an answer, and he'll leave me alone. But I want to be able to give him an educated answer. I figured he'd probably. I didn't so much want to put him in his place, but I guess that is what I wanted to do. I wanted to show him that I was open-minded, that I could read it and not be swayed by it and not be upset by it, either one. Well, as I said, the Francis Schaeffer book was just over my head because he's talking about Renaissance art and philosophers, and I just wasn't educated enough about those kind of things to think critically about them. But the book of Ecclesiastes interested me. It was sort of I wish I could remember the title, but I don't. But it was almost a coffee table-like book. It had pictures. And, of course, Ecclesiastes is the book that says, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. And it talks about life. And I remember that made an impression on me. I thought, well, whoever wrote this book really understands about life, because it was not all holly jolly, everything's great. It was very pragmatic, worldly in not in a sensual sense, but worldly in a sense of, this is very practical. And almost a resignation about life. I think one of the songs that was popular on the radio back then was Peggy Lee's "Is That All There Is?" If that's all there is, my friend, let's keep dancing. It was almost kind of a depressive type attitude through the writing, but it struck me as very, very realistic. So I thought, oh, well, that's interesting. There's a book in the Bible that, it seems like it relates to modern, or it's timeless, because it could obviously related to ancient times, but could relate to modern times as well. And then the third book was Mere Christianity. And in Mere Christianity, in fact, I think I've still got a copy. Let me see. So this is it. I'm pretty sure this is not the copy that I read. But I was flipping through it, and I came to this passage. And I literally was flipping through the book. I mean, I wasn't reading it sequentially. I'm flipping through. I don't know whether I want to dedicate time to reading the whole book. And I came across this passage. I had no idea at the time that this is one of the passages, if not the passage, that C.S. Lewis is most famous for. It was titled "What Christians Believe." And when I did flip through, what was coming through was that precise British way of writing, impeccable logic. And so, I was sort of impressed by what I read. But this really gripped me. He says here, yet, and this is the strange, significant thing, even his enemies, when they read the Gospels, do not usually get the impression of silliness and conceit. Still less do unprejudiced readers. Christ says that he is, quote, humble and meek, end quote. And we believe him, not noticing that if he were merely a man, humility and meekness are the very last characteristics we could attribute to some of his sayings. Now that impressed me. I thought, well, yeah, that makes sense. A guy who says, I'm humble and meek, and says the other things Jesus said wouldn't be humble and meek. I mean, we think a person like that was out of his mind or something. So Lewis goes on to say, I'm trying here to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. That is the one thing we must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on a level with the man who says he is a poached egg. I love the British sense of humor. Or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to. So at that moment, at that instant, I knew that I could no longer stand in this place I'd been standing. Now, that doesn't mean I was a believer at that point. I wasn't ready to sign up for the whole thing. But I saw that my position of saying, who can know? I saw that was not a tenable position, because Jesus said something, his words were such, and all that time I'd been in the Catholic Church, I'd never really been confronted with his words, at least not in that way. I mean, in the Catholic Church, I was confronted with saints and the Trinity and Mary, and you're just overwhelmed with entities you got to deal with. But here, what I was hearing from my high school classmate and from C.S. Lewis was, there's one person you need to deal with. You got to make up your mind about one person. Now, one person is Jesus. That's what the Bible's all about. That's what it all points to. Now, I'm going to do this testimony, I'm calling it, in 2 parts. I'll do the other part next week. But I was around all that religious atmosphere growing up, but it was only when I was in my late 20s and someone confronted me with Jesus the person that I saw the light, that I recognized there was something here, someone here to either accept or reject. But that to sort of stand and say, well, I don't know, was not a reasonable answer. And I certainly consider myself a reasonable person. Well, I'm out of time for today. The Bible's about Jesus. He's our God. He's our example. Let's live for him. Amen.